all of the Abrahamic religions have had major effects on the way we think about gender, on the way we think about the roles of men and women. Almost exclusively, the Abrahamic religions are led by men, and until very recently, that was even more true. It's only very recently we've seen more women in leadership positions. Often, the official religious leaders are only allowed to be men in many cases. However, women have always been an important part of religious communities. It may be familiar to you if you attend a church that the person in charge, the preacher, the minister, is a man, but you'll find a lot of the work of the community, organizing events, making sure people show up, making sure the community stays together, is often done by women. An important question within these religions, being as they are monotheistic, having a single God, is what is the sex gender of God? The major prophets of the three religions, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, are all men. There are many women in these texts, and there's many important female figures, but the most important ones tend to be men. In both Judaism and Christianity, God is often described as a father, is often depicted as a man, particularly an older man. In Islam, however, there is a strong rule against personifying God. Muslims do not understand God as being a person. It's against the rules in Islam to draw pictures of God. You won't see any depictions of him in the way that you do in Christianity and Islam. And so mosques, for example, are decorated with geometric patterns and with writing. They're absolutely beautiful. You can see a picture here. And this view of God that it doesn't really make sense fully to talk about God as a person is increasingly adopted by people throughout the Abrahamic religions who see the description of God as a man as more of a metaphor, or God as a father as more of a metaphor than an actual description of his kind of physical being or appearance. So we talked about patriarchy. Patriarchy is the social structure where men are in charge. We looked at lots of evidence for that. Another aspect of patriarchy is not just men being in charge, but also particularly masculinity being seen as superior to femininity. So men that express a lot of feminine traits are not typically the ones who are in charge, and similarly women who do achieve within the power structure of patriarchy often have to exhibit or take on masculine traits in order to do so. And this comes from, or part of this, it's not the only cause of it, but part of it is the idea of God in Judaism and Christianity as this father figure, right? And there are three characteristics here we think about when we think about God in these religions. God is a provider. He provides for humanity. God is a protector. He defends humanity. And God is a punisher. He is responsible for ensuring that humanity follows the rules and punishing us if we do not. And this same understanding of what it is to be a leader is reflected in the kings of feudalism. And they often saw themselves and presented themselves as being effectively a god on earth, or one step down from God, or ordained by God as being, God's representative. And then the father in the family, who is seen as being the king of his own family, right? Of being in a position of God towards it, and a similar attitude and a similar role towards his family as God had towards humanity as a whole. And you still find people who think about fatherhood in this way and think about the role that men are supposed to play in the family in this way, and talk quite explicitly about how men are supposed to take their guidance from the way that God behaves, particularly in the Old Testament here. And this connects to patrilineality, as we talked about, the idea of passing down the family inheritance and name and line through the male name. You see a number of different approaches to gender in the Abrahamic religions. I'm going to simplify it down to three different ways of thinking about it. The first is male domination. This comes from the idea that God is a man, that the prophets are men, and that therefore men are supposed to be in charge, men are supposed to be more powerful, men are better than women, men are closer to God than women, and that women, in the same way that humans should take their leadership from God, women should take their leadership from men. So that's the male domination concept within the Abrahamic religions of how we're supposed to think about gender. The second one is called complementarianism. This is the idea that men and women are fundamentally different. They have different roles given them by God. This doesn't necessarily put one gender on as higher than the other, as more important than the other, according to complementarians, but rather the idea that, both genders are equal, but they're equal in doing different things. So complementarians typically see women as supposed to be in the home as mothers and so forth, whilst men are out in the political realm working and so forth. But complementarians would argue this isn't supposed to be about male domination. This is supposed to be about women and men doing the things that they are intended for by God. And complementarians would argue that the problem our society has, in as much as women are not in a good position, is that we don't respect those roles that women take strongly enough. So complementarians would argue that the thing that women need is for us to respect motherhood more, is for us to support women more in their roles in the home and so forth, for example. And then finally we have egalitarianism. This is the idea that men and women are entirely equal before God, that God created men and women with the same degree of holiness, the same possibility of what they could do, and that any separation between them is undermining that. These religions have had an important role in the social justice movements throughout time. The resistance to slavery in the US was often a very Christian-led movement. People like Nat Turner, John Brown, for example, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, were all deeply Christian people who were led by their Christianity. The civil rights movement, of course, was led by people from across the religions. The Southern Leadership Christian Coalition was very important in organizing the civil rights movement, and were led in this idea. It was a major debate at the time. Many people believed that the role of religion should be outside of politics, that ministers shouldn't preach changes in society, that they should just focus on people's spiritual sides, just focus on people getting into heaven. And so the idea that ministers would lead a political movement to try and get the laws changed was seen as a big problem by a lot of other Christian ministers. And if you've read Letter from Birmingham Jail by Dr. King, that's a direct response to that idea that he's not supposed to even be engaging in this kind of practice. The Quakers, who are a Christian religious group, or a religious group of Christian origin, have been very important in social movements in this country, including the movement against slavery, the abolitionist movement. Quakers were often the people who provided the safe houses on the Underground Railroad. And then Quakers were also very important in the women's suffrage movement, the right for women to get the vote. And part of the reason for that is Quakers had a belief that they saw of radical, I don't know what to in past tense here, Quakers still believe this, in radical equality, the idea that everybody is equal before God. So Quakers don't have ministers or preachers in their meetings. Anyone can stand up and preach the word as they understand it, and that included women. And this meant that in the 18th and 19th centuries, one of the few places where women could stand up in public and talk and be listened to and be taken seriously was in Quaker meetings. And so a lot of these early women who were very important in the movement for women's rights were originally Quakers. Depicted here on the right is Alice Paul, one example of that. And then finally, not finally, there's lots more examples, but the last one I'm going to talk about is nuns. Depicted here on the top left are the Sisters of Providence, who live just down the road from us. And they've done all kinds of activism, particularly against torture in South and Central America, organized by the United States at the School of the Americas. And nuns have a really interesting history. If you go back to the Middle Ages, pretty much the only option for a woman if she didn't want to be beholden to a man, if she didn't want to get married, was to become a nun. And being a nun meant you could be in a community of other women, a community where men had very little influence and control over your life. They were still ultimately underneath the men who ran the church, but on their day-to-day affairs, they, relied on other women, and they were interacting with other women. Nuns were allowed to engage in intellectual pursuits and, be self-led in their lives in a way that almost no other women were. And so there's a very long history of nuns who were powerful women who have spoken up for social justice, and that's still very much true today. So the Abrahamic religions have both been an influence in terms of preserving patriarchy and reinforcing patriarchy and creating this message that men are supposed to be dominant, but they've also been an important force in challenging that and changing the way that we think about gender and changing the politics and the laws in our country.